Yeah, let's talk about the litigation process. Fun. Hopefully, you won't find yourself in too many of these. I will say, in my banking career, never actually did I have to go through or be a part of a trial. The actual trial where you show up and there's a judge and a jury and all that, but a lot of this stuff leading up to it certainly had to. And the process talks about, again, we're talking about enforcement, right? We have to be able to enforce contracts and those types of things, and also to be able to correct wrongdoings. I saw in the news today that they were again talking about or maybe it wasn't in the news, I'm sorry, maybe it was something that somebody had posted, in the discussions about the ongoing cases of mesothelioma and those types of things from Libby, from the vermiculite mine up in that area, and how that's still an ongoing thing. And even though it was shut down 17 years ago, but we need to have a system whereby those folks that were adversely affected by that, or their families now, can effectively get some type of compensation for the harm that has been dealt to them. So in a court setting, we've got plaintiff versus defendant, and those are the most important ones to remember. Certainly there can be counterclaims where you get a counter plaintiff and a counter defendant, and you probably have a counter and all that other good stuff. But if you know the plaintiff versus the defendant, that's what's important. I wouldn't worry about this. Appellant versus appellee, of course, the appellant then being the person who lost in the first case, and they're appealing it, so they become the appellant, and the appellee then is the other. Petitioner versus respondent, I see this when I look at court proceedings and whatnot, oftentimes in divorce cases, and I think that's more because it's a no-fault type of thing. We're not saying that the person suing for divorce is the plaintiff and the other person is the defendant. It's a petitioner versus the respondent. It's kind of a little more subtle, I guess, maybe. And then third-party defendant, I think that was part of your guys' homework, if I'm not mistaken, and so you probably have a pretty good grasp of that. If the particular case can't be fully settled, maybe without bringing in somebody else, retailer versus manufacturer, when you have a lawsuit going on, sometimes you have to bring in those third-party defendants in order to satisfactorily do it. Sometimes it's because the original defendant may have gone broke, may file bankruptcy or something. So getting into court, the number one thing is you have to have standing. There has to be subject matter jurisdiction, and there has to be personal jurisdiction. So a standing to sue means, we go all these, I'm sorry, so I won't dive into them individually now because they'll be coming up here. So standing to sue, right, must involve actual case, and you have to have a personal stake in the resolution. The Need Now case, and it's in your book, I believe, is one of the sidebars maybe. I think David Need Now is the guy's name, and he sued on behalf of his daughter because he didn't think it appropriate that she was saying the Pledge of Allegiance in a public school, and because it had the words "under God," and he's an atheist, and so he sued on behalf of his daughter. And it was kind of an interesting case. I can remember following it a little bit, and as it moved through the courts, it got to the Supreme Court, and they accepted it, and everybody thought, good, now we'll have a resolution as to whether or not the words "under God" in a public setting are appropriate. And people waited, and what's the Supreme Court going to decide, and la-da-da, and finally they came out with their decision, and their decision was simply that David Need Now was not the primary custodian of the daughter. The mother was. They'd been divorced, and so he didn't have a personal stake in the controversy, so he had no standing. And so the resolution of the "under God" words in the Pledge of Allegiance remains unsolved or unresolved. So It was interesting. Subject matter jurisdiction, the power to hear the type of case, is general limited. Again, we got city court, JP court, right? So the power, if you get picked up for running a stop sign in Havre, probably going to be city court, right? If it's a felony in Havre, that subject matter, there's probably going to push it into the district court. And I have to admit, sometimes I think these boundaries for me when I'm following some of these cases get to be a little blurry. Not a simple traffic thing that's going to be city, or if it's out in the outside of the city limits, it's going to be a justice of the peace court. But you get certain dollar amounts, certain things, and especially as you get higher. I think there was a case in the discussions, and it talked about there's a hearing to determine by the magistrate, one of the federal magistrates, to determine if the case, that might have been the one with the vermiculite, to determine whether the case should be heard in a state court or a federal court. So I'm glad that I'm not the only one that sometimes is a little bit confused. Some of them are kind of clear cut, but there's cases, a lot of cases, that it's not clear cut where that needs to be heard, and sometimes they have to have hearings to determine where it's going to be held. So the court's authority over parties, again, summons service, long-arm statutes. So, if the crime occurred in Havre, in the Havre city limits, and it was running a stop sign, and whether you're from Havre or from Timbuktu, the court has personal jurisdiction over you because of where it took place and whatnot. Technically, long-arm statutes say that they can reach out. They could actually go and get you and then bring you back and make you stand trial, or subpoena you, summon, service, those types of things. For smaller cases, again, that becomes probably not so common, but for bigger cases, it certainly is. It is common, and that's kind of what those were designed for. If you committed a felony in Havre, Havre would want its pound of flesh, and so they might Havre, in this case, the 12th district, it was a felony. They might reach out and have you served or summoned if they know where you're at, and have you extradited or brought back for trial. So again, allegations, standing to sue, you have to be involved in that personal stake. We've kind of already hit that. The adversarial relationship goes back to what we've already talked about. Again, the subject matter, we've kind of hit all of these, right? Our state district courts are kind of a general jurisdiction, so it doesn't matter if it's a civil case or a criminal case, right? Depending on the amounts and those types of things, it can hear any case basically, right? Limited, there's authority to hear specific kinds. We have water courts, right, and workers' comp courts that would do that. And then the diversity of citizenship, brings into those things where the federal courts might get involved if the amount in contest or in controversy exceeds $75,000, then it may end up in a federal court. Okay? And federal issues obviously end up in federal court. Kidnapping across straight lines becomes a federal offense. Personal jurisdiction, voluntary submission, they call it, to the court's power. The venue, you hear about change of venue, and sometimes, they'll move a court case simply because there's too much publicity about that case, and so they don't feel that they can impanel an impartial jury, so they'll move the venue. But venue just talks about where it's taking place, is all that means. And voluntary submission means, I don't know if it's always voluntary. I guess if you get arrested in Havre, maybe that's considered voluntary, but you're there, right, versus being summoned. And I think that's what they're just drawing a distinction here. Again, if it was a small case, or even in a larger case, even if you're arrested, it's kind of voluntary. You're there. They don't have to summons you. The long-arm statute again deals with out of state. It could be if a tort was committed within the state. Again, it could be a negligent or intentional or strict liability tort that would make that, we could hold that hearing or that trial, or that case, we could hold that in a state court, right? Property within the state, okay, or a transaction occurred within the state. And go back to that BNSF one that we talked about and how they were trying to sue in state courts in Montana, even though the alleged negligence or the alleged tort took place in other states. Okay, well, they're suing because BNSF does have ties to Montana, but the Supreme Court's going to look at that and make a decision whether that's appropriate or not, and we don't know the outcome. Okay, we don't know the outcome of that yet. So again, I wish I knew that these were black and white, but you'll hear me say often that when we talk about the law, there's all kinds of shades of gray. Extradition is that process of bringing somebody back. Okay, so if somebody did commit a crime here and then they flee, we have a right to bring them back, stand trial, and we can extradite them. Oftentimes what happens, they get arrested someplace else, and then the someplace else looks it up and realizes that there's an outstanding warrant for them, and so they call up and say, hey, we got your guy, come and get them. And then, most of those are a pretty simple process. The state that picked them up is probably happy to get rid of them so they don't have to feed them on their dime, right? And so we go pick them up. Sometimes when you get political things involved, even from state to state a little bit, sometimes it may not happen. I can see that with some of the immigration issues going on, where you have sanctuary cities that may be reluctant to release a prisoner to another state to stand trial if they thought the other state was going to deport him or whatever. But certainly in national too, we see some nation states not wanting to release prisoners back to the U.S. or vice versa because we're concerned about how the justice system works. So let's stop there for now, and we'll finish up in some other videos.